Hello, my name is Vassilios from Action against Hunger in Germany. Today I'm talking to Raj Patel, who's the director of the movie The Ant and the Grasshopper. Welcome, Raj. It's a pleasure to talk to you today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Vassilios. Thank you for having me.
Raj, when I first heard the title, The Ant and the Grasshopper, I heard that before, and I remembered it's a fable by Aesop. Could you explain us why did you choose this title?
Well, actually, the title, like so much of the film, wasn't our idea. It comes from a story from Malawi that our lead character, Anita Chitaya, has shared with us. And she tells a story that's very unlike the Aesop fable. In Europe, we know the Aesop fable about the grasshopper sitting around while the ants are doing all the work. Here in Malawi, the story of the grasshopper is that once it is dead, it can be lifted and moved, even though it is so big, by lots of ants if they are working together. And so this is a different kind of way of understanding the grasshopper as a burden that we all can move, but which we can't move if we approach it individually. So it's a slightly different story, but it uses the same iconography as the Aesop fable, but in a very different context.
All right, thanks. This makes really much more sense for me now, the title. Thank you. You mentioned Anita Chitaya already. She's the protagonist of your movie. Could you describe us what kind of person she is?
Anita Chitaya is a mother and a teacher and a farmer and an activist. And she has the spirit of a children's party entertainer and also a military general and also a philosopher. She is an incredible person and one of hundreds of activists in this organization called Soils, Food and Healthy Communities. But I think what makes her particularly interesting is not just her life story, but the way in which she is able to extract some very deep and generalizable ideas that then she can teach to other people about how to change the way that we live and act in the world. And so she's someone who's very empathic, but she is very grounded in her beliefs, and she is able to, through that listening skill and through her skills of persuasion, to change not just,
Thank you. Your film is also kind of linkage between hunger and, or describes the linkage between hunger and climate crisis. Could you describe us what effects the climate crisis has in Malawi? And
Vassilios, as you know, communities that are facing hunger are never just facing hunger. They're facing lots of other crises at the same time. Poverty is always multidimensional. So the hunger crisis is also a crisis of inequality. It is also an ecological crisis. It is also a crisis of government and of democracy, and a crisis of inequality in different, very plural ways. And so because there is, for example, gender inequality in some communities in Malawi, and because of the way that manifests itself, where women, for example, have to go fetch water. And so some women will get up very early in the morning to go carry water from the single spot where there is enough water to be able to bring home. But with climate change, it takes longer and longer for this well to fill up again. And so if there is a long line of women, then they will have to wait even longer to carry the water to bring it back home. And when they get back home, they may face husbands who are unsympathetic to the amount of work that women have to do. And domestic violence is a corollary of hunger around the world. And we heard from people in Malawi that this was a concern that climate change would through hunger and through patriarchy, make domestic violence worse. So, these are multiple crises all at the same time, and it does manifest in hunger, particularly if, the crops are, flooded, or because of climate change, you have new pests coming into an area, and that affects the quality of the crops. But it's not just about the weather. Climate change is much bigger than the weather, and the story in Malawi demonstrates that.
Thank you, Raj. There's a sentence Anita is saying much in the beginning of the movie. If you want somebody to change, you go to their doorstep with your problems. So what she's doing then is she's traveling to the US and the White House to address their problem. Could you describe us what happened during that trip and what kind of people she met there?
So it was Anita's idea. Excuse me, let me start again. When Anita learned about climate change, the first thing she said when she learned that Malawi was not really driving climate change, but the climate change was being driven in large part by historical emissions from Europe and from North America, she was saying, well, do you need me to come to America, where you're from, so that we can persuade people? So her theory of change is very much connected to the way that she has been able to make change happen in her village to combat child malnutrition, where you go to someone's door, you say, look, here's our shared problem, let's figure it out. And she wanted to do the same to the United States. And we tried our best to get interviews with our Department of Agriculture, our Department of International Development, with the Environmental Protection Agency, and with the White House. But they understand this theory of change, that if they are confronted by somebody who insists that, in fact, this is a shared problem and Americans need to change, the departments here know that that is a real challenge to them. And so they didn't give us any interviews, nor did the Gates Foundation. This is not just a government problem. We tried with philanthropy, we tried with the World Bank, and none of these organizations would talk to us. Luckily, we found some sympathetic lawmakers here who were able to open their doors, and in the United States we have something called the Green New Deal that has been championed by one of the people whose office did talk to us. But in general, we had conversations not with lawmakers, but with other farmers and other people involved in the food system in America. And that in itself was very interesting, because even though a lot of the people that we talked to were organic farmers in one way or another, not everyone was agreed that climate change is an issue. We tried to speak to large industrial farmers. They didn't want to have anything to do with us. But even small organic farmers are still struggling with their understanding and responsibilities around climate change. And so some of those conversations were very tense. And then other conversations we had, particularly with black farmers in America, as opposed to white ones, were much more sympathetic, because black farmers and black communities in America are much more in the front lines of hunger, much more in the front lines of COVID, much more in the front lines of poverty. And so they understood that climate change, poverty, and a range of other things are very much connected. And there was much more connection, I think, between their work here in the United States and Anita Chitaya's work in Malawi.
Right, thank you. Raj, you work as a scientist, an author, and journalist, and you're an activist, right? Storytelling and activism is one of our main focus on this year's Human Rights Film Festival Berlin. So I'd like to ask you, what does activism means for you, and what do you think can activists achieve?
There's a lot of debate in the United States about whether activists should even be calling ourselves that. Because at some level, activism of the kind that Anita Chitaya does is another word for surviving and changing the world so that she and her communities can thrive. That shouldn't be a profession, that should be what we're all doing. And I think that there's a good argument for saying, well, you shouldn't really call yourself an activist. On the other hand, I think it's important to flag that the work of making change in the world happen is work. It is the sort of thing that maybe isn't, or shouldn't be professionalized, but should be regarded and upheld as worthwhile work in the same way as parenting, for example, is not usually compensated, but it's nonetheless work that is done, reproductive labor that we need to survive, and we need to name it. So as activists, as caretakers of the world, of web minders, of people who are caring for the next generation, what we can achieve, I think, depends on the scale of activism. I mean, in the short term here in America, for example, I've been working at volunteering at the food bank, excuse me, because we've had such high levels of hunger here, particularly under COVID. But that volunteering at the food bank doesn't end hunger. Food never ends hunger, because hunger is about poverty. And to end poverty, we need structural change. And in those moments of structural change, the storytelling is very important. And I think activists are storytellers. And there's lots of data, good scientific data, that shows that actually stories can be protective. I've just finished a research project with a medical colleague who was looking at, we were looking at communities, indigenous communities in Canada. And those communities that are able to tell stories in their own language about the world around them have lower levels of type 2 diabetes than other indigenous communities where the stories have been taken away. Stories can reconnect us to one another and to the web of life. They can make certain things seem normal and other things seem very strange. We live in a very strange world right now. A lot of the work of activism is to render the world strange so that people can say, okay, well, I used to take for granted that, food where I couldn't read or understand most of the ingredients on the list, I thought that was normal. And I thought it was okay that, we get by with maybe 10% of our population hungry, 20%, 30%, 40%. But reframing that story as a story of right now, we live in a world where 2 billion people, more than 2 billion people are food insecure. So roughly 1 in 3 people on this planet is food insecure. And yet we think the stock market is doing very well, so everything must be fine. Reframing this story as showing hunger as a political choice that has been made for the poor by the rich, and also a political choice that we can unmake and we can do differently. That, to me, is the possibility of activism. It is to render the world strange, which is why film and storytelling and writing books and writing novels and fiction is just as important to the work of activism as the policy analysis and the good scientific data. Ideally, they all go hand in hand together.
So let me come back to Anita Chitaya. Could you tell us? So you made this trip to the U.S. and the White House, and then she went back to Malawi. What was her impression about this trip, about the conversations she had with people?
Well, she saw that, first of all, America was beautiful. One of the things that she was saying over and over again is how much water you have here. And how green it is. And, we came in the middle of summer, so not necessarily the greenest time of year for the United States, but still, she was impressed by the natural beauty of the land and the possibilities of the land and the ways that so much of it was still forested and very beautiful. Excuse me. One of the other... But America is not homogenous, and I think she saw that. She saw that for some people, life was incredibly rich and generous and full, and there was more food than people knew what to do with. And then there was, she noted, the racial and the poverty divide. She was shocked that while there were some houses that were so big, they had other houses on top of them, is the way that she described it. And that seemed to her unbelievable. At the same time, there were people outside those houses who were homeless. And this, this absolute irreconcilability between the vastness of the resources and the poverty of the people was something that she was struggling with a great deal. She was also very concerned about the racial divide. We are a racist society here in the United States. Of course, Germany knows one or two things about that. But here we are a settler colonialist society, and a society that flourished because of the enslavement of people who look somewhat like Anita. And she was troubled by that. And I think she was also saddened by how little people wanted to hear her in government. She was always welcomed wherever she went. She and her mentor, Esther Lupafia, we all traveled together. And wherever they went, they were welcomed generously and kindly. And she was very grateful for that. But she was quite upset also that Americans seem untroubled by how badly we are treating the planet and how those consequences are really very bad for Anita and her village, because we're too comfortable in this country. And that comfort insulates us from the consequences of our actions. And she was a very astute critic of how this comfort is what enables us to pretend that we don't have to suffer the consequences of our actions. So she's very ready to teach and very ready to help us change, but she observes quite correctly that between her willingness to change and where we are now lies our unwillingness to confront what it is that we have done, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of ignorance. But there is this barrier between us and our willingness to change, and that is what saddens Anita perhaps most of all.
Thank you very much for the interview, Raj. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Vassilios, it was a pleasure, and thank you so much for your work. I remember Aktion, gegen Hunger from. I used to live in Düsseldorf, so I remember back in the day there was a lot of good work happening, and I'm very grateful for your support and the work that you're doing.